Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today is Monday, November 18th, 2024. You're listening and watching the Daily AI Show live. And today we're discussing what has been in the news recently, which is this idea of has AI slowed down or is AI slowing down? So much so that, Beth was just informing me that Sam Altman responded back to it. And so that's really what today's conversation is about. It's just, is that the right place to be focusing? Is it even actually a fair question? Is it realistic? And even so, even if it was slowing down, what does that even mean? Isn't there plenty for us to focus on otherwise based on current abilities of AI? So with that conversation today, we have Beth, Andy, Carl, and I'm Brian. And I think Beth, you're the first person. You're the person I want to kick this off to, or give this to. I'll get my words right. It's Monday. Um, so you can kind of kick off the conversation is what I was trying to say. So go ahead.
Sure. So there have been a bunch of conversations in X and LinkedIn and also in various tech news sources asking whether AI is slowing down. We're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of ChatGPT in 12 days, because I think it's November 30th. The difference between 3 and 4 was massive, right? Like, you really felt the difference between like high schooler and PhD, or kindergartner and like middle school. Even like that's still a pretty giant giant leap. And the question has been bantered around about whether the current scaling laws, which have been talked about in terms of like um, there's no end necessarily, right? Like, it looks like if we're just throwing more data and more compute at training models, we're going to continue excelling in the same ways that we have been excelling. And there has been some doubt thrown into that. Now, part of the doubt is the ingredients that we're talking about. Are we nearing a end of the kind of quality of data that we want? Is compute not an endless resource? Because that answer is no. No, compute is not an endless resource. But are there some scaling things that we're hitting in terms of that? Specifically, we're talking about OpenAI, because of course Elon has his megapolis stuff that is not hitting a wall in terms of compute. But the conversation around that. Oh, and in response to all of those, Sam tweeted, "There is no wall." Right? We have not hit a wall. There is no wall. And the point that I think is relevant to talk about in this conversation is why that discussion is a distraction. It does not matter, because for businesses and for professionals who are using AI right now, everything could shut down and we would still have massive gains to make in terms of how businesses use this, and in terms of how professionals use AI, for like several years moving forward. And it's not shutting down now. But if it did, talking about how fast, like, I used to be running 50 miles an hour and now I'm running 35 miles an hour. Right? Like, I'm slowing down, but there's still a ton of ground that is still being covered. And that's my perspective on today's conversation. Andy, did you put something together that
Yeah. Oh,
give
I have
us a
some comments
foundation?
about that. Um, yes, it's probably true that the advances in AI capabilities that are a function of scaling compute and scaling training data, that's probably slowing down. But that is by no means the end of the frontier, right? There are a lot of different methodologies that are at play right now in research labs and elsewhere that are moving forward towards AGI, and that's going to be dramatically better than what you see today. It's not going to slow down in terms of increased capabilities within the models themselves, but it's not going to be driven by compute. It's going to get the models, as we know, have become smaller, more capable, and even in smaller sizes. and there are techniques to circumvent the really high levels of energy and expense that are required to train a model. We've talked about a number of those on the show, but I wanted to just draw your attention to one of the things that, like, it seems to me like a major breakthrough, and it just was announced last week at MIT. And it was MIT just developed a new way to assist models in solving problems with a technique they call test time training. I'm not going to use that term again just because it doesn't capture the important difference between what previously large language models did and what this method does. Okay, and it's specifically this. In the old days, like last week, models would have fixed parameters all the way through their very deep trillions of parameters in their neural network. Those parameters don't change at the time of inference. You put through your context, it processes that, and it makes its prediction and outputs incredible value in the form of human language and deep research that the large language models demonstrate today. Well, this new system allows neural networks to expand their capabilities for logical reasoning and problem solving by adjusting parameters dynamically to the current input data. So, we have this whole idea of training, and then you set the weights, you set the parameter weights, and then you put in your information, and those weights don't change. Well, this new method that MIT demonstrated and literally announced this week is changing the weights dynamically in the process, much as I think a human brain probably does, adjusting the way it actually employs and or literally able to grow new neurons in the course of thinking. So we have not touched the end of the frontier here. That's an important point. And on the other point that you're making, businesses are adopting AI in dramatic ways, and in the investment community, there is a shift away from heavy investment in the frontier model companies toward companies that are reaching many billion-dollar valuations in record time in the world of venture capital, and that are focused on domain-specific applications or specific training of these models. So we have, not only have we not seen the end of the development of the capabilities of AI, but we're seeing very focused applications and companies rising to enormous valuations because they are addressing very large markets with new capabilities due to focus on a specific domain.
Right. So the idea is, in this context, we're over focused on OpenAI as well, right?
Yeah.
Because OpenAI so far, right? Like OpenAI has been, what's OpenAI doing? It's going to dictate what's happening in AI across the board. But what you just said, Andy, means that that's also a false measure at this point in time, to say that and also to a certain extent a false measure to look at like the big companies, right? So if OpenAI is not advancing, if Google is not advancing, if Anthropic is not advancing, and there's arguments that all of them are, right? And Meta, sorry, Meta, you are, and also for me, and I apologize for that, but that is true.
Don't forget XAI, because now that Elon Musk runs the country, he's got lots of resources to move that forward.
If Meta isn't also ran for me, I don't even know what XAI is. Like, okay. But if we're just looking at those five, we're missing a ton of what's happening in AI and being able to predict.
I think the part that sort of stood out to me was what you were saying, Andy, and that's that, just where we are with user adoption. I know we talk about it all the time, but we are in the bubble. But very quickly, when I talk to potential clients or prospects and people that are interested in what we're doing at Scaled and, the kind of solutions we have with AI there, it does become pretty evident that there's still a very, very low adoption. Now, I do think just in 2024, I have seen a drastic change in how many people are quote unquote using ChatGPT. But what that probably means is even then, you have to break that down even more so, because it's not just are you or are you not using ChatGPT. The reality is you may just be using it for simple, a one-off inputs, right? Like you just, it's there and you're like, oh, let me go ask that really quick. That's drastically different than having an AI first, mentality, or working for a company that has an AI first mentality. I mean, it's you could both check a box on a survey that says, do you use ChatGPT daily, and have drastically different outputs and throughputs of what you're doing. So that to me is the biggest part, is that we're just now, we're still ramping up. And so all these potential use cases that people haven't really put a lot of time and effort into, because there haven't been enough people doing it in that specific niche or field or whatever. And they're going to, uncover all sorts of amazing ways and new ways that these current models can be used. And even so, I know people like to say like, oh, we haven't seen GPT-5 and we probably won't see it in 2024. But I go, yeah, but 4.0 was a drastic improvement. Sonnet was a drastic improvement in Haiku and Opus. What we got with 01 preview, and where that probably is coming out of, I know, Carl, you were talking about that in our Slack community, like 01 preview coming out of the preview, and they're saying there could be a big bump there. So it's weird to me that we get super fixated on a number like 5 when all these smaller moves in the right direction happen across all of them too. Like to your point, Beth, or whoever's saying it, like it's not just OpenAI. It's Meta has made some massive improvements this year. We like to dog on Google, but Google has made some massive. Hell, Google had one of the biggest stories in the last couple months with their Notebook LM, and that's a Google product, and what they're able to do with that. Nobody else has done something that sounds like what Google produced with Gemini. So they're coming out there. Microsoft, their CEO just recently announced that they think they've solved the memory problem, and that they have a way to have near infinite memory. That news story came out, I think, yesterday or the day before. So, there is like, for what we've seen just in 2024, I don't personally see a slowdown at all. I agree that there's no walls, but also, like everything else we're saying here, it hasn't even gotten into the hands of 50%. We're not even close to 50% of people who are actively using these tools to their full extent. And what happens once we get there? And that's just a matter of time, to get there.
I want to go into just a little bit of technical when we talk about, pre-training versus inference versus post-training, because I think a lot of the OpenAI employees came out and, kind of started discussing what was the difference between the amount of like pre-training you could potentially do, what could be done. And people are like, there's still a lot to do, but it's a lot of inference now too, a lot of post-training, that there's a lot of things what O1 has now been able to do, what they could do with synthetic data. So maybe the assumption, I think it all maybe stemmed from the Information article and then Bloomberg came up with it, talking about how Gemini, they weren't happy with it. And then, OpenAI, like Orion wasn't really up to snuff, but again, not sure where the truth lies in that reporting. But also, if you look at things in the audio space, in the video space, and if you have a chance, go listen to Ben Affleck. He had a really, really, really good response on what AI could do, is capable of doing, versus what humans can do. And
that was an educated response.
Very, very good response in terms of who he believes is in a very difficult space, like VX producers versus actors. And he laid it out and like, that is 100%. Like that makes a lot of sense. But he even said like all the things it lowers the barrier for people who want to make a goodwill hunting because they have the tools and won't be too expensive for them to do it. But for the actors themselves, right, that still requires. So that's a different conversation. But I also think too, you're right, Brian. I think we in the AI bubble have this ridiculous expectation to jump, and maybe it's because we've been fed it and we've seen it, to have these ridiculous leaps. But if you think about, like, imagine if computer use came out last year, everybody would be going even more bonkers, right? What OpenAI did last week when they did the work in apps feature, and it's just for coding, but that apparently has the interactive component to it in, and then what they're doing with Canvas, and then what you see with all the talks with Project Astra, what Anthropic does with their computer use. So I'm just like, when I look at it, it's like, what are you talking about when you're slowing down? Is it just like the jumps in large language models? Because there's a lot of other stuff to
Here. I hope they slow down so I can keep up.
because it's really, it's
still there.
But you know what though? That's the thing, is like, there was this weekend, there's all this news about when Orion's going to come out, when Operator's going to come out, when O1 preview versus like O1 itself. If you think about the level, and there's always this chart about O1 or GPT-4o, then O1, then O1 preview, and then O1, and how big the capabilities are. And there's this really awesome, if you want, like, I feel like total insider information there's a person named Ark. I gotta give it once. I gotta find that thread. He and his company does red teaming for companies like OpenAI. So they red teamed 4.0, they red teamed 4, they red teamed 01, and apparently they red teamed whatever was 5 and other models too.
Most people probably know what red teaming means, but take a sidebar here and just explain.
Oh yeah, so
red inside information. Yeah.
So just for those who don't know what red teaming is, they just want to make sure these things are safe and don't actually, people can't use them for nefarious means. And so they actually automated. If you think it's a little bit of manual, but it's a lot of automations. They've actually put together, like, here's what these models will run through. And they don't get, apparently from what quote unquote Brian says, is they don't get the full model. What they get versus what's released in the public is actually, what's released in the public is better. They get a small sample of it and they have to run it through the test to ensure. And the notes on some of the red teaming. So for O1 red teaming, what was really neat about the real world planning attacks, manipulation. So how do they can see, it's like, hey, we need to put these measures. And if you listen to the Dario Amodei conversations, he talks about those levels too, AS1, AS2, AS3, and they put their models through those testing too, to see what happens. And then what are the guardrails they have to put in if it starts doing that, if it starts reaching some of those levels. So, but you have to think when Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, Mustafa Suleyman are talking about all these things that are coming, and especially with Sam, because he usually previews a lot of the stuff he talks about, and then it comes out. It's like, okay, that's pretty neat. And just one last point for me, working with a whole bunch of businesses, they don't even know what I would say 5% know what Anthropic is and what Claude is. They think it's like this French guy. And I was like, no, Claude's a large language model. It's like, could you spell that? It's like, so that's where we are. In the bubble, everyone's like, this is the model, here's the benchmarks. In, I would say, the real world, no one knows the benchmark. They equate ChatGPT equals AI. That's it. ChatGPT free equals AI. And I do it to write my emails. Oh, one last point. Or Copilot is kind of AI, but it helps me write my emails too. And it sucks for Excel because I can't get it to work.
Yep. You could say the exact same thing about Sheets, right? About
Yeah,
Google's AI as well, because
yes,
also,
exactly.
also in Sheets, it's like, no, you know how to write the formula, and
Yeah.
then tiny rant.
Mhm.
When you write the formula for me, don't embed, here is the formula for you, the formula, and then like something else. So when you copy it, it copies all that stuff. Like, I'm in your spreadsheet. I just want the formula when I hit copy, right? Like, I get it. This is just wrong. Interesting that you brought up Anthropic, because Anthropic is not actually in the same boat of needing more and more and more data, because Anthropic is already training on like self training, like playing games to increase its abilities. So when Anthropic makes a leap, it has less to do with that they found a great chunk of amazing data that nobody else found. They are literally taking a slightly different path.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I've always loved about Anthropic is their approach through having a constitution. And so I also admire them for, maybe they will someday, but not necessarily feeling the need to connect to the internet. It's like Anthropic knows that by having the constitution that they built around and the parameters, and then obviously it's continuing to be a smarter and smarter model. It's sort of proving that it it isn't necessarily all about compute. It isn't necessarily about having access to the world, the web live with live data, because they're not doing that yet. They consistently stay at the tops of leaderboards for what they're able to do. So, I think it just shows that there's other ways to go about this. And of course, we're talking about some of those today, that it could be more about inference, as we saw with O1 preview. There's just different ways to go about, and they're learning new ways all the time on how to use this data more efficiently, make it cheaper to use, which obviously also was going to drive up innovation, right? So these API calls, that they're racing towards zero. I mean, they're never going to be free, but they're going to be at such a low cost that they're no longer a barrier for even the smallest of companies, and that itself will drive new innovations, new workflows, new ways of using these same models as the cost comes down. Because right now there's still a prohibitive limit to what companies do. I mean, most companies can't just open up the API through, even if they have the great solution, can't do it on like their chatbot. If they have a really high traffic website, they would get crushed. Even at 3 cents, they would get crushed at volume, right, to do that. So you have companies now that have to be like guarded about, like, hey, we know it's capable of doing this, but we can't open up the floodgates on this. We would get crushed. But once the cost gets to a certain point and people can start deploying these like really, really helpful interactive chatbot type experiences or voice type experiences on websites, for really high volume websites, that alone is going to drive new innovations and new ways to use these same AI models. So just cost alone, right, is going to make a huge difference here. It's not that the models have to get smarter. Sometimes they just have to get cheaper so more people can play, or at higher volumes.
That's such a good point. Because that is another, that's like, it's not a scaling law, but it is another law that we're just seeing happen. And one of the things that does in the context of being able to use these models is that we're the ones showing how to use the models, right? Like routinely, they put their models through red teaming, as Carl said, but then they kind of release it into the wild to see what we think it can do, right? The people who are going to use, and then they start paying attention to the patterns that we're creating by using it, and then it starts to move in those directions. So there is a definite interdependence between the users and the people who are creating the models and doing their own kind of thing, because there are many more of us who are using it. but we are generally limited because our costs are not being paid by the company that we work for to find out what it does,
Yeah.
right? So all of those pieces are also coming into this. And as models, I think we're going to start seeing more and more of this. Particularly, I think it was Amadei's interview with Lex Friedman, the 4 or 5 hour one. Carl, I know you did. That you listened to that. One of the phrases that came out of that was AI isn't programmed, it's grown, right? Like it grows. And that's another reason that like we can't just look at it and say, "Oh, well, we know that it could do this before, and therefore if we make it better, it's going to be able to do this exact thing only faster, more cleverly, whatever those things are." That's not how this works, right? It probably can, but it's not like we just added like we did a turbo boost. And so everything that was happening before is just happening faster or happening better. It's not that kind of thing. And I think we're still really at the forefront of trying to understand what that means.
Yeah, there are certain emergent properties when you take a large deep neural network and just feed it data. They're not specifying, they're using techniques to improve the performance of that model, but there are things that happen in this very, very deep neural network that are unanticipated and can be identified in retrospect, but they didn't do anything other than just feed it data and let it figure out, how to do the calculations given its architecture to do that. And that's, I think, what it means to me that we are growing them, right? We're just feeding them some nutrients and see what happens, and then picking and choosing the ones that have particular capabilities that we find useful in our pursuit of intelligence. I wanted to shift a little bit to what's happening in the world of investment, and some commentary by some venture capital folks who said, okay, look, like the big players like Microsoft, big tech companies like Meta and Microsoft, for example, they have enough resources that they can fund their AI efforts kind of forever. And yet, they have some inadequacies in their own internal strategies that make it so that they aren't going to be the ones who create the new directions for AI. That's going to happen in startups, which can execute on a higher technical level. And I'll characterize Anthropic as a startup, right? That's a startup compared to Microsoft. It's a very small company by comparison. And it's pushing the boundaries of what AI can do. And so you have this situation where Microsoft is hiring people from startups to try to bring that knowledge inside their company. And yet Microsoft and Copilot somehow, even though they have adopted OpenAI as very, very capable platforms, they've done something that makes, from our perspective, Copilot not as effective and much more difficult to work with than the OpenAI versions of the very same thing. So there's limits there. And what this, circling back to what I started with, this venture capitalist said, if you ask me what's going to happen in the next 2 years, the big tech companies are going to end up being value-added resellers for a lot of the startups that are working and making these advances, right? They're no longer going to be able, because of the rapid increase in valuation, they're not going to be able to acquire these things and integrate them and kind of consume them and hide them. These startups are going to have their own independent direction, but the large companies like Microsoft will be a reseller of those. And that he says, has never before been seen in the history of software. The velocity of these startups and their technical accomplishments and their approach to valuation, levels that we've never seen before, that's new. And that's why things aren't slowing down here. These things are really taking off in a big way.
Yeah, and this isn't like our we'll definitely have a show coming up where we talk about our maybe 2 shows, maybe a recap on 2024 and our predictions for, what we see coming in 2025. But as you look towards 2025, some things we feel fairly confident about because, the big players have announced things and said, hey, this is potentially coming. Some of it's hearsay, some of it's just, chatter on X and whatever. But we definitely know there's some big advancements coming just off of what we have today in 2025. I don't know if that's a ChatGPT 5 or it's just named something different like Orion, or never mind OpenAI. It's some other player will be the one to release, the next model that just sits atop of these leaderboards for months upon months on end. It doesn't have to be ChatGPT, or OpenAI. There's certainly others out there. So, we'll definitely have a show talking, I think, more about those sort of predictions and what we kind of see coming forward. It's always fun to do those. But even with what we know now, we can tell that I wouldn't say it's slowing down. I think when people say slowing down, they're really referring to their expected pace based on, previous maybe results or whatever, their expected pace of how things should go. And there's a lot of hype cycle and stuff. So maybe some of it is shooting themselves in the foot from these companies because sometimes they get in their own way. And I think that leads to, overhype in some areas. We've certainly seen that. We've contributed to it in some ways with some of our conversations. It's hard not to. But also, I just think it's important to point out that it's not like there is a playbook here. There's things we've had in technology that are, comparable in some ways. We can look back at the advent of the internet and say, oh, it took this long to do. But really outside of something like that, what's the playbook for AI? If it really is something that's being grown, what's the playbook here? So for anybody to really say like, oh, I feel like it's slowing down, I feel like it's speeding up, you got to go like, well, if the only thing you have to compare it to is the last 6 months, yeah, okay. But also, like, how are we to say that that's not exactly the way it's supposed to play out in terms of what can be done? Again, it's not like we can look back 6 years and say, well, in that instance of AI, this is how it rolled out. And comparatively, we really have slowed down. It's like, I don't know. It's like trying to see the forest for the trees. We're all so in it and so close to it. How can you really sit back and judge? We're too new. We're talking about, you just said it, Beth, at the beginning of the show. November 30th is 2-year anniversary from when ChatGPT became readily, generally available to the public. And so a lot has happened, obviously kicked off in those 2 years, but it's still only 2 years. So pretty tough to like sit back and go, oh, I can see this from 10,000 foot view. And I can see the playbook, and yes, absolutely, this is a slowdown. It's like, compared to what? Unless you're going to look back at the last 6 months, and is that even relevant, honestly?
Well, and yeah, Carl, go.
I just want to point that, remember, these companies are pretty much putting these things in the wild and getting us to figure out how to use it. Because so in any other, tech, there's a very defined, hey, this is where we think, or this is where we want you to use this technology, whatever it is. This thing is, here it is, go knock yourself out, right? Send it to developers, go to town. I don't know what you're going to do with it. Here's what we think you could do with it. And then people find these amazing things that you could do with it. So as long as that's still coming out, and even like you said, Beth, if everything stopped today, we'll have years of people trying to figuring out the new way or how to use these tools, integrated in their work, integrated in their personal lives, integrated all sorts of places that it's just endless. But I think the issue is I like to use, whenever I do presentation, I like to use, hey, what if the iPhone 16 came out the year after the iPhone 1 came out? No one would know how to use this thing. It's like, what is intelligence? What is, like, I can swipe, but all these different, like, hold to swipe, like even how to use it on the phone, but then all these businesses that have been built on top of it, all these things that the expectations, the behaviors, that hasn't been even it's all malleable right now. So I think like whether for the bubble, the expectation, yeah, in your mind, it may be like for those like who want the latest and greatest every single week, every single month, right? Who have the Sam, like, what are you doing? Like match Anthropic's release. I was like, and what's funny is we know that these labs, and even what Mustafa Suleiman said this weekend, oh, we have prototypes for infinite memory. Well, all of them have prototypes that aren't being released yet. Even if you follow that Brian guy, he said we've tested models that haven't even gone to public. We got them. So it's up to the company to release them whenever. So they have models that are ready to go, but they just haven't released it. But again, whenever they release it, it's not like they come with instructions. They're just like, hey, go do whatever you want with them. And that's kind of fun for us.
Right. Such a good point. And what we haven't talked about is the push in the market for releasing. And we know from study after study that OpenAI is considered, we just said it, right? OpenAI for the general public is synonymous with AI, right? A ChatGPT is synonymous with AI. It's like Kleenex and tissues, right? They are interchangeable for a lot of people in terms of what they're experiencing. And the majority of people who say that they've used ChatGPT have used the free version. So there's not a huge push for them for market share to try to make things a ton better. We have seen that that knowing, I mean, I'm not saying that I understand their internal conversations, but they do periodically release more stuff on the free tier, right? So like, oh, you get 5 more conversations with this, or now you can get access to custom GPTs. You can't make them, but you can use them, right? Those sorts of things. They are like incrementally adding things, but it does not seem like a push to market is going to dramatically change their market share in terms of their business, right? Same with Google and Microsoft. That's a whole conversation about Microsoft. What, why, what, those sorts of, yes, we all have questions. But they have their defined market space because so many people are using their products in their businesses, right? So again, there's not a huge push to add more stuff, particularly when it's kind of disappointing. And both of those companies have had some disappointment in their people who are using their things, like, hey, this isn't actually as helpful as you think it is. And it takes a lot of time to try to figure out how to do something and then be disappointed by it. That's not a market push. And the others, same with Meta, right? Meta's just adding it to the ways that you experience Meta in general. So I think that's another piece of this in terms of slowing down. We're not necessarily seeing what is actually happening in the development in the companies. We're just not experiencing the continued, my experience in this is getting better. I have more access to things that make my work easier, better and better and better. I think that's a key piece of this too. And the motivation just isn't there. And what we see instead, the pattern is when someone releases something that everybody else is excited about, it's like Pez dispensers, right? They have something teed up. So like if somebody's going to release something, now like everybody else's Pez pellet comes out. Okay, now we all released it. Now we can all wait again. We're like, we have the next thing teed up.
Yeah.
So
We've seen that several times where, there's some big jump in, AI video production or something like that. And then, runways the next day. And then there's another one the next day after that. And you're like, okay, yeah, they didn't create this yesterday and just happened to coincidentally be on the same day. Like you said, they're all trying to get their blip, their blurb, in the blogs and the future tools, and, and the AI news and us and everything else, and get their line out there. We'll wrap it up with that for today. But keep coming back the rest of this week Don't forget, you can go to the dailyaishow.com. You can go to the QR code that's on the site, on the screen if you like. You could sign up for the newsletter over there. The newsletter just went out yesterday morning, but don't worry, if you want to be on the list and ready for every Sunday that it goes out there hereafter, you just have to go over to the website and you can sign up for it. It's completely free. We only send it out on Sundays. And it's just truly a way for you to get additional information in the AI landscape news, things that just don't necessarily make it onto the show, or deeper dives of what the show, a couple cartoons, things like that. It's a good newsletter. We're proud of it. So if you haven't checked it out or signed up for it, be sure to do that if you have time. With that, we'll wrap it up for today. Come on back tomorrow and the rest of the week. We got some holidays coming up. I'm sure we'll have a show about the 2-year anniversary. That technically is a Saturday, so maybe we'll do it on the 29th, the day after Thanksgiving here in the States. But we have all sorts of great topics coming up in the next few weeks. So keep on coming back each day, and we will see you again tomorrow. Until then, bye, guys.